Start over.
Okay, hi, I'm Richard Saltoun, founder of Richard Saltoun Gallery, and welcome to the last reading group in our series of events that have accompanied the gallery's year-long exhibition program devoted to Hannah Arendt's Between Past and Future. This is the first live event that we've had in the 1.5 years that we've run these, and I want to thank very much Roger Berkowitz, our special guest, who's helped us throughout the last 1.5 years and who's here today just flown in from New York. As many of you know, the readings have been organized in accompaniment with our exhibition, and the current exhibition is called The Conquest of Space. And it's the starting point of works including Sylvia PLIMACK MANGOLD, Elaine REICHEK, and Carey Young. I also want to thank all of the panelists who have worked with us over the past 18 months. I want to thank Gavin Delahunty, who's acted as exhibition advisor. I also want to thank all of the speakers, and also in particular Lynsdey Stonebridge, who's here tonight, who will shortly be publishing a very important biography of Hannah Arendt, and Lynsdey will be leading tonight's event. Thank you, Lynsdey.
Thank you, Roger. Richard, sorry, that's a good start. It's like calling all the girls Rachel. Now, I also want to start by thanking Richard and the team for this amazing series. And I don't think any of us could have imagined when the series was conceived that we'd be living in our own between times without no testament. And so to have this between time in conversation, I certainly have benefited. Roger has been our host for all these sessions for the past year, dialing in from New York. So it gives me great pleasure to host him here in London tonight in person for our collective reading of the last essay in Between Past and Future, The Conquest of Space and the Status of Man. Roger won't need much introduction to most people in this seminar, but just to remind you, Roger is the founder and director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College, where he's also professor of politics, philosophy, and human rights. He's written many, many books and articles, two of which I think are probably particularly relevant this evening. His first book, The Gift of Science, which was on Leibniz, and a book that's coming out in 2 weeks' time, The Perils of Invention, Lying, Technology, and the Human Condition. There are a few scholars who know Arendt's opus quite so well, or have thought about her work with such diligence and care as Roger. I just also want to mention, he embodies for me, and a lot of other people here, I think, two key Arendtian values: friendship and a commitment to plurality. And by friendship, I don't just mean that Roger's a nice guy, and he is very nice, but he does really understand that politics begins between friends and our openness to the thoughts and judgments of one another, which also, I think, when the chips are down, which they are at the moment, is perhaps the strongest defense of plurality that we have. So how this evening is going to work, this is experimental. Roger's going to speak a few words addressing the essay and laying out some key ideas. Roger and I will then have a conversation for a bit longer. I shall ask a couple of questions, and then our virtual panel on the wall here, dialing in, will join in, and then we'll open up the floor to the face-to-face space. And for those of you who are joining the webinar virtually, if you want to put your questions in the chat, we'll be attempting to respond to your questions as well. So it's just 3 things for me to think about as chair. So Roger, can I ask you to open up?
Thank you very much, Lynsdey, and thank you, Richard. It's when this started almost 2 years ago, when we first started talking about this, the hope was that we would do a number of these events live here, and I'm just glad at least we got one. So I want to thank you for your perseverance for organizing what's been an amazing exhibit, to the extent that I've been able to visit it virtually and now here in person, and also this reading group. and to Lynsdey for participating the whole way through. We asked you to be the first person to discuss the wonderful preface to this book, which you did a great job, and then you've been on all the calls, so appreciate that. And Lynsdey and I sort of just realized, I mean, we knew, but we've talked so many times over so many years. This is the first time we're meeting in person. So it really is a wonderful thing. And it's great to be here with you. Thank you. So this is the last of our reading groups on this book, Between Past and Future. This is a book that Hannah Arendt once called her most important book. And I happen to agree with that. I think I would put it this way, it's her most Arendtian book. And my colleague Thomas Wield and I have talked about this as well. She is at heart an essayist and someone who attempts things, tries things out. People sometimes ask me, what do you most like about Hannah Arendt? And I said, she is fearless and she's provocative. And I think especially for teaching undergraduates, but just generally for reading, you know, the fact that when I read a new essay by her, it's rare anymore, but even when I reread an essay by her, you sometimes don't know where it's going to go. And that's an amazing thing. And when you look at our world today, where most of the people who write publicly, you know what they're going to say about anything. It really is an amazing quality of hers. This last essay is it's probably, I've said many times, it probably is my favorite essay in the book. It is for a whole lot of reasons, but let me just back up. It's called The Conquest of Space and the Stature of Man. I could do two things with that title to say. First of all, you could, instead of Conquest of Space, you could call it The Rise of Modern Science and the Stature of Man. Space is to some degree a stand-in for science. And a couple of times in this book, in this essay, she says space or from which it emerges. Conquest of Space is scientific for her. What that means is it emerges out of the idea of generalization, of intense generalization, intense abstraction, and intense theorization that separates us from common sense, from reality, and from the earth. She doesn't talk about it so much in this book, but in The Human Condition, what she calls earth and world alienation are both rooted in the rise of modern science. It's wonderful to be speaking in front of this amazing work of art on Mars. This is Mars? Yeah. Those of you who know The Human Condition know that it starts with the launch of Sputnik and her raising the question of, well, you can't change human nature. What is human nature? It's not about human nature. Human nature, she says, would be the same anywhere, including on Mars, but you can change the human condition. And in many ways, this essay is about the changing of the human condition through science and through the conquest of space. And her question, and this is one of the things I also love about Hannah Arendt. I mean, you know, she wants to argue it, and yet she also raises it only as a question. She'll never say it, but right, the question, the last question, the very last line of the book, you know, is we're perilously close. She says the conquest of space and the science that made it possible. So again, space and science go together for her, have come perilously close to this point. Well, what's the point? And she says, if we should ever reach in earnest the stature of man, another word for the dignity of man, would not simply be lowered by all standards we know of, but have been destroyed. We are perilously close to having the dignity of man destroyed. This is a theme that begins in her first book, or her first published book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which is about the loss of human dignity. And she says the subterranean streams have destroyed human dignity on earth. And we need, she says, to create a new articulation of dignity, which she calls the right to have rights, which we won't get into today. But she does believe that happening in totalitarianism is prepared by science, by the rise of science. And this essay is about that. And so She says, as I just quoted, that we are perilously close to this. What is it that we're perilously close to? That all our pride in what we can do will disappear. Why are we perilously close to that? Well, look at the metaphor she uses at the very end of the book. She quotes Werner Heisenberg, right? And she says of Werner Heisenberg that we could look at man from such a distance out in space, look down on man from Earth, such that we will look like in our cars, like snails in their shells. And this is what science, this is a metaphor for the Archimedean point, as she sometimes calls it, citing Franz Kafka. But this is what science does. It looks at everything from a universalist point of view. It decontextualizes, generalizes everything. And it turns what it looks at into simply data. So if you've all seen these studies where they show, little data points of where people are going through based on their cell phones, right? They track you through your cell phones, and they can show all the different places you go, and they can predict to a very, very good accuracy. They can come and say, Lynsdey, we know where you're going to go tomorrow, because we look at people, you and people like you, and we can predict where you're going to go. And it takes out freedom, it takes out vitality, it takes out dignity, it takes out humanity, and it makes us into mere data, snails in our cars, snails in our shells. And this is what we are perilously close to. And this would be what she calls the destruction of the stature of man or of human dignity. She has another quote that she uses in the end, in the final chapter of The Human Condition, where she talks about if we were to go up in space into a spaceship, and in that spaceship, everything around us, of course, because it's a spaceship, is man-made. We would be living in a man-made world. And then there's one more jump. It's easy to imagine that in that spaceship, in that man-made world, of course, our food is man-made, but not only that, we become man-made through genetic engineering, through whatever process or test tube, whatever. She talks about this in The Human Condition. That will happen. And in that world, she says, the sort of magic of humanity, man becomes simply a piece of data to be manipulated and used in the most efficient way possible. Lynsdey's going to hate me for this, but this is what Martin Heidegger would call Bestand. It becomes, instead of a Gegenstand, an object that stands against you, we become something that stands to be made use of in any way possible. And this is, I don't think you can read Arendt's thinking on science without Heidegger in the background. Okay, that's sort of a general introduction to some of the issues in this essay. I'm not going to obviously go through the whole essay; it's a complicated essay. But I want to point out a couple things. First point I want to make is that she makes a big deal that we're asking this from the layman's point of view, not from a scientist's point of view. By the way, that wasn't necessarily her idea. She wrote this essay in response to a call for papers from a journal, a group called Great Ideas Today. And it was a symposium on space in 1963. And she didn't publish it with them, I don't believe, but she wrote it in response to that call. And they asked for thinking about space from a layman's point of view. And it's important, this theme of distinguishing the layman and the scientist is one that runs through her work. If you've read the preface to The Human Condition, you know that it's a big part of that as well. A scientist is somebody who emancipates themselves from reality and from humanity and from the common sense world. A scientist is someone who always asks one or always believes in one question or one idea, right? The first principle of science, as Leibniz articulated it, was nihil est sine ratione, nothing is without a reason. Everything has a reason. Nothing is without a reason. That means that if you can't give a reason for something, it doesn't exist. That's the radicalization of the Leibnizian thesis that Heidegger engages in. And what that means is that the scientist basically interrogates the world for reasons, and if you can't come up with a reason, it doesn't exist. And this means that the world is constantly interrogated. The world is constantly, the reality of the world is constantly in question. The Cartesian response to this, right, which is a big part of the human condition, is to seek certainty in the self, in subjectivization. And this is why for Arendt, secularization means actually subjectivization. And the Enlightenment means we turn everything into ourselves, because we no longer believe in the outside world. And this is what leads to world alienation. We begin to question everything that we see, that is in common, and the stories and the things that are between us and unite us. The scientist says, well, these are all questionable, and we have to investigate them. And so the scientist, she says on page 261, is forced under the compulsion of facts and experiments to renounce sense perception and hence common sense. The scientists have to separate themselves from, you all know this, that the sun rises, but of course the sun doesn't rise, right? Or if it revolves around the sun, you look in the water, you see the mountain. Of course, the mountain's not there. You put a stick in the water, it looks bent. Of course, it's not bent. The scientist renounces common sense. And what do they, and this is strange to us, because we think, not all of you, because you're smarter than that, but we think that science is based on observation and facts. And Arendt says, no, right? It's not. Science is based on thinking, on rationalization. When Galileo said there were mountains on the moon, did he see mountains on the moon? No. What did he see? Does anyone know? He saw shadows. And he deduced from shadows that they were mountains cast in the shadow. And then through theories of refraction and this, calculated the height of the mountains on the moon to within like a few meters of what we now know them to be today. Not because he saw them, not because he observed them and measured them, but because he had theories. And so science for Arendt is about the theoretical overlaying of reality and the interpretation of the facts and the observations we have through theories. And thus it's a way of rejecting our worldly and common reality. And so to ask from the layman's perspective is to ask from the perspective of reality, of common sense, of the world as what is between us. And that's where she's coming from. And she says, even the scientists, to the extent they're citizens and people, also think this way. And yet, to the extent they act as scientists, they reject it, they forget it. As scientists, qua scientists, they reject the world. And, this is an important insight of hers. It's one of the reasons she is so skeptical of intellectuals, experts, and scientists throughout her life. She says one of the greatest tragedies in the 1960s, she's writing in the 1960s, one of the greatest tragedies of modern government is the rise and the entry of problem solvers and of professional experts, professional problem solvers into government. She was obviously a huge You're usually skeptical of bureaucracies and bureaucrats, but it was more than that. I mean, bureaucracies are important because they are the rule of nobody, but science is important and experts are important because what experts do is present a non-real theoretical overlay of the world and call it true. And here she makes this distinction, and it's an important one, between scientists and plumbers, right? Scientists aren't dangerous, she says, because scientists are not really out for power. What scientists are out for is to generalize. They have a lust, she goes out, urge to generalize. But plumbers, the experts, the engineers, the social scientists, the government bureaucrats, the public health officials, get to a controversial issue, they want to take the science and impose it on you in a way that exerts a kind of power and tell you that this is truer than the reality you see. And so she's very skeptical of that, and she's worried about it. The question of dignity, she says, makes no sense to a scientist qua scientist. That's on 262. The scientific world is a world of data and theory. And it used to be, she says, that scientists sought to think in order to order the world and the human world, but that's no longer the case. She says now the point of science is to discover a truth beyond the human world through symbols and math. They no longer speak English. Science has gotten so advanced and so complicated that you can't even express most scientific ideas today in a language, any human language. It has to be through symbols, mathematics. And I'll just give you one example of even beyond that. So it comes from the Princeton Plasma Laboratory in Princeton, New Jersey. And about a year ago, they developed an artificial intelligence machine learning tool that would predict planetary orbits and planetary motions. And they predict them better than any humanly developed computer program or model has been able to do. What's so exceptional about this Princeton lab, though, is that they don't put in theory, gravity or this or that, and tell the model, use these theories to do it. They simply feed in data. And as one of the lead scientists there wrote in a piece that was quoted, I think, I'll have to get you the site, but he says, it's a black box that can predict accurately without a theory. It goes from data to data. That's an extraordinary, and you should worrisome idea that you should think about. We are creating machines that go from data to data. That means there's no way a human not only could understand it, that's already true with the models that we created, but it has no humanity to it. It has no human thought of it, no human thought of the theory, no human order is imposed on it. It's pure algorithmic prediction that's more accurate than anything humans could create. And that's where the danger lies, that we're creating these systems that work, that are more accurate, will provide more money, more benefits, more housing, more health than anything we could create. But the trend is moving us further and further away from anything we could understand, anything we could order or make meaningful. Lynsdey and I were talking before that, to me, the two sort of fundamental ideas underlying Hannah Arendt's work are freedom and meaning. And if we give to these computers and these programs and these non-human intelligences the power to, in a sense, order us, then we're going to be living in a world that's not humanly created in the most excessive way, the most incredible way that we could imagine. And the risk is that we will leave the world of our senses completely, not only in theory, but in reality. And that we will increasingly build a world that is safe, comfortable and secure. But for whom? Right? And, you know, she says on page 270 that a scientist in this way doesn't care about humanism, but she goes further and says scientists don't, as scientists, cannot, this is an essential point, cannot care about the survival of the human species on Earth as a scientist. Why? Because humans are just data points. And to the extent a scientist argues, you know, and is part of the Atoms for Peace or Concerned Scientists or a global warming initiative, they're not acting as scientists, she says. They're acting as people, as humans. As scientists, it doesn't matter if the Earth survives or if there's just cockroaches on it. Why value humans more than cockroaches? And so the increasing power and influence of science is that it is precisely a worldview that is universal, what she calls universalist science, comes from an Archimedean point outside of the Earth, and thus inhuman, unearthly and inhuman. And this brings us to the end of the essay that I started with, but I'll just remind ourselves on it, that the dream of the Archimedean point that Archimedes had, that you could lever the Earth, leads us to a scientific theory that we can see ourselves and all on the Earth from this universalist point of view. But we've now moved from theory to reality. We can actually build things that don't not only see the Earth and us from outside of the Earth and from a non-human point of view, but from a universalist point of view in which even the Earth is simply one speck in the universe that really doesn't matter. And it's in that kind of situation where science treats us as data to be manipulated, to be understood, to be made better, to be improved in any way possible. That is the real peril that she talks about. So Lynsdey mentioned this book, Perils of Invention, which is an edited book, I should say. But the premise of the book is that in human inventiveness is always at war with our common sense reality. And that there are two ways in the modern world that we humans increasingly see reality as uncomfortable and worth abolishing. One is politically, and so we create ideologies and propaganda that deny reality, because reality is often uncomfortable and plural and things we don't like, because we want to feel like we're part of a meaningful, unified, total system. And the other is through technology and science, which increasingly sees the common sense world as uneducated, heathen, antediluvian, human. And we need to replace that with scientific knowledge. So I'll stop there. It's a wonderful essay to end on. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Roger. That was brilliant.
It's so nice to have a crowd.
Yeah, it's great, even with phones.
Yeah.
Breath. It's great. I think I have two questions, but I wondered, Arendt gave a version of this paper called The Archimedean Point to a group of engineers, like scientists, the plumbers. So she went to see the plumbers. And in the middle of talking to the engineers and plumbers, she said, you know, progress is not semi-temporal, not eternal. It won't go on forever, which is quite something to say to engineers and scientists in the 1960s. And which, I'm kind of wondering that the point at which we've got to is the point where she wants to say this is the end of progress at that point. So that's the general umbrella. But I was also thinking, as you were talking, I reread The Human Condition over the summer, which I agree with Samantha Rose Hill on this. Every time I read that book, I think I've never read this book before. I've got no idea what it's about. And you have to re-encounter in this brilliant way in this essay too, that she makes you re-encounter the things you know, and she does it every time. She does that on the level of rhetoric and language and thought. But what really struck me in reading that book was not just the alienation which comes from that moment, the Heidegger moment, where suddenly everything, the world, becomes for our use. So you don't just see water on a mountain, you have to make it into a canal. You don't just, you have to keep redoing it. You're making it useful. But there's another side to that as well, which she says is even worse, which is capitalism, which is accumulation. And that's the point, that the useful things become commodities and then they vanish. There's another level of that which really worries her. And so I suppose my question there is about, thank you, Richard, what's the relationship between scientific life and economic life, and how are those two things working quietly in this essay, but absolutely quite loudly, I think, now. And following on from that, I was also thinking, as I was thinking about accumulation and the use of nature and things that we want to use and make in our own image, would then become alienated from the earth. And I kind of would like you to say more about earth and world alienation. Because I'm always reminded when I read this essay and the human condition, that the human condition was like 3 years before Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. This essay, which is, you know, the first book to talk about the damage we were doing to nature, and the idea that not just science, but the sort of lethal combination of science and accumulation was doing. And I've looked in the archive and I can't find any mention of her reading Rachel Carson, and it's the kind of another meeting you wish could have happened, because that would be such a great conversation. Because some of the ways that Rachel Carson writes about what we've done, about alienation and the anger and the truth-telling is really, really Arendt. So I kind of think this flip side to space and science and progress and development is also earth alienation, which is very much, I mean, when she was writing under the cloud, the literal clouds of atomic catastrophe. And the scientists she liked were Oppenheimer and Heisenberg. But the cloud we're under is climate destruction, is world, not just world alienation, but world destruction. So there's two things I guess I'd like to hear you on. One is the relationship between scientific life and economic life and the human condition. And the other one is what's the relationship between science and earth alienation and where we are now at that level of destruction.
Excellent. Those are great questions. You also said something about progress at the beginning. I mean, you know, Arendt is one of those people who doesn't believe in progress, and she really sees progress enter the lexicon with the scientists, and specifically in philosophy with Hegel. And for her, progress means is another scientific attempt to deny human freedom. It's to say that the world will, whether if you're Hegel, so the world will unfold in certain ways, and we have to just go along with it, and we have to reconcile ourselves to that. And the world court is the world justice. You know, whatever happens is what's just, and she finds that really repulsive. Or Marx, which is that, you know, we're going to move towards this, and we don't have a choice, and it's dialectical materialism. So you know, she's not a fan of progress. So when she says to these engineers that progress will come to an end, I think she doesn't want to get into the whole thing. She's not going to talk about Hegel to them, maybe, but you know, she doesn't think that. I mean, there's no doubt that science has given us great things. Get to the moon. It's given us. I can come here. I can fly here. You know, I mean, there's amazing things science has given us. We're on Zoom. I don't know about that one. But for her, there's always costs, and so I think it is important to understand that she doesn't. Well, she's not in any way a Luddite, and she didn't live her life as a Luddite in any way. She is skeptical of the claim that all this technology is making our lives better. I think it changes it, but I don't think she thinks it makes it better. But the two really fascinating questions you raised about alienation, different ways, two different kinds of alienation. One is, you said that that in the human condition, interestingly enough, you use the word capitalism. It's not the word she uses.
No, it's not.
She uses the word consumerism.
Yeah,
And I don't think she thinks they're the same.
Yeah.
I don't know if we want to get into a full-on discussion about that. I'm happy to.
I think it might be a bit boring.
We can come back to it in the Q&A, but let me just say that what Lynsdey is here referring to is a chapter at the end of the section on labor and in the human condition. And that's important to know, because what is labor? Labor for Arendt is the principle of life. That whatever any living being has to labor to produce the condition, the subsistence, the food, the housing, whatever it needs, whether you're an ant or you're a human being. And so you labor to live. And so labor is the principle of life. And it's in that, and so in that sense, what she's saying is Marx, who was a brilliant thinker of the alienation of labor, somehow thought that if we got to the point where we had enough to live with, we would stop laboring and start living. And she says that simply hasn't happened. The more we labor, we don't stop laboring so we can enjoy time playing, the violin or chess or, fishing. We labor more to accumulate more and more things. And she says, that's not capitalism. That's the life. That's a deep human life. Well, she doesn't think it's about life. She thinks it actually is, but it's the laboring principle that she thinks, unlike Marx, is not tied to capitalism, but is deeper than that. And that the more we labor, the more we acquire, and we accumulate and we consume. And we don't have this point. We don't reach a point where we say enough's enough. Let's just go fishing and hang out with friends. And that's a critique she makes of our society. But I don't think it's a capitalist critique. I think she thinks it's true in Soviet Russia as much as it is in capitalist, wherever there's a capitalist country. I haven't seen one lately. But it ties into this book in a very interesting way. And I don't know how many of you saw it, but when she's talking about computers, she says that there are a group of people, right, who think that computers will suddenly be able to replace humanity, right? That they will, be able. That computers will become humans, right? And she says this is a fundamental mistake because it mistakes the difference between brain and mind. And she says what computers are showing us is that brain power, simply the ability to compute, is something that computers can do better than we can. And but that's not mind, that's not meaning. And she compares brain power to labor power. And she says the fact that computers supplant and enlarge human brain power rather than labor power causes no perplexity to those who know how to distinguish between the intellect necessary to play good checkers or chess and the human mind. So you can create, just like you can create a machine that makes better widgets than I can make by hand and makes them faster, cheaper, and better. You can create a machine that plays chess better than any human being can play chess. And we've done that. But that's simply to say that chess, despite what many people have wanted to believe for a long time, is not actually a human game. It's a calculating game. And there are better species than humans at calculating, including computers. And so labor power and brain power are two things that we can increase beyond the natural human capacity and alienate them. But in the end, that she doesn't think they go to human dignity, because human dignity is outside of our calculating power or our laboring power. What goes to human dignity is when we actually see our mind as simply a data point. And that's what the book is about. Do you want to, is that, I can wait, I know there's another question, but do you want to talk to that or not?
No, that's good. I mean, I would come back, but there's another conversation about wood thieves and
Wood thieves?
and the kinds of alienation. I mean, I was
Right.
thinking that when Arendt starts to read Marx, there's these early essays of Marx, when he's responding to the privatization of woods in Germany.
Mhm.
And so it is kind of a grab on
Forests,
nature, forests.
Yeah.
And young Marx is sitting there trying to work this out. He said, well, actually people who just used to live with the woods have suddenly become wood thieves. And she says he was absolutely right to, that moment where you had to kind of go and buy the wood and commodify, I would say, so one, you're alienated from property, you're alienated from your own labor, and you're alienated from the wood. And I always think that that's a kind of scene for her, because she likes Marx as well.
Yeah.
That he gets that right. So it's just my kind of defense of.
No, I mean, she loves, I mean, when she says in that chapter, Marx is going to be criticized here, and I'm sorry about that,
Yeah.
because, everyone's criticizing Marx. I love Marx, right? That's what she says. And she takes a lot from him.
Yeah.
But I just mentioned the capitalism consumerism thing because, I mean, there are a lot of people out there trying to argue that Arendt was anti-capitalism.
Yeah.
I don't think she defends capitalism. I don't think that's a thing that she ever wanted to do, but I have never seen her criticize it. In fact, she certainly defends private property. And so, we could get into definitions of what capitalism is about private property or profit motive, whatever. But I don't think she sees consumerism as caught up in capitalism. There is alienation in both.
Yeah.
This brings us to the other question on Earth versus world alienation. And this is, one of the beautiful things about Hannah Arendt is that she's not a systematic thinker. I'll go to the mat and grave on this with anyone if they want. She just doesn't have a system. What Margaret Canavan once said, she writes and thinks in thought trains, which has always struck me as right and beautifully said right at the beginning. What's amazing is that over time, like I was just teaching the Dreyfus chapter the other day in the Origins, and she talks about how the mob is the refuse of all classes. Now in chapter 10, if you read it on classes, she says the mob is class-based, the masses are the refuse of all class. Now she went back and rewrote this book, and she didn't change it. And it's one of the things that always, I'm like, well, as an Arendt interpreter, what do I do? Do I say that she just didn't change it, and she really means masses in chapter 4? Or do I say, I don't know, maybe she meant something else. I have no idea. I mean, what do you do with this, right? And she's, she uses words differently, and sometimes she's running for the New Yorker, and sometimes she's running for Political Science Quarterly, and she uses words differently. And part of actually reading her is understanding that. So Earth and world alienation, this brings it up. She means something different by them, but she's not always consistent in the way she uses them. And this is one of the problems reading her is, who am I to say this? I mean, I'm an idiot, and I feel terrible. I mean, she's not here to say you're an idiot, Berkowitz. So I don't know, but she does use them differently. But basically it's this. Earth, she says, is the quintessence of the human condition. That's in the preface. Interestingly enough, it's a sentence that's not in the German edition of the Didactyl. But what she says about earthliness is that part of us as humans that are about life, about labor, about living and breathing and reproducing, but also about what's given to us. She says, like fate or fortuna, or if you're religious, God. God's will. And so part of being a human being is that we are an animal put on this earth, needs to breathe the air, needs food, needs sustenance. And we don't control our fates or our fortunes. And that's part of being human. But there's another part of being human, which is being that we are artificers, that we can make things, both pens and books and stories that change the earth, both physically and meaningfully. And these two parts of our humanity, worldliness and earthliness, have for thousands of years been part of who we were. The human condition, this is how I read the human condition, not everyone reads it this way, is largely a book about the earth and world alienation. World alienation is largely a product of what she calls the Protestant Revolution and the Age of Exploration, the two great events happening around this period, in which in the world of explanation, we make the world bigger and thus smaller, and we start to see ourselves not as localized in a particular place, but part of a global citizenship. And thus we alienate ourselves from our local cultures and local places and become world citizens, which she thinks is alienating. And Protestantism alienates us because we begin to accumulate and other things and labor as well. And we lose our tie to the land, and we lose our tie to our house, and we become accumulating capitalist citizens, consumer citizens. But the other major alienation is the rise of science. And that's what she calls earth alienation, which she says is even more dangerous than world alienation. And that's that's what she's talking about in this book, the complete loss of common sense, the loss of the denial of even human language between two human beings. And in the end, the reduction to everything, including humanity, as simply a full artificial production, originally governed by men, right? We can do genetic engineering to stop certain diseases and do things and get people stronger. But eventually, if anyone thinks this isn't going to happen, she would say you're a fool. It's not going to be run by men. It's going to be run by algorithms. And we're going to reproduce according to algorithms. And anyone doesn't see that, she would say, come on. As she would say, there's one chance in 100 that it'll go the way we control it, and 99 chances out of 100 that it'll be the algorithms that control it. And I think she's right.
But also the coming together of well, we've seen that now. I mean, it's the coming together of the algorithm with the consumerism.
Yeah.
Click buy, click buy, click buy.
That's right.
Which is most of our lives. So in some ways, if we go back to the last paragraph,
yeah,
have we reached the point?
No.
This is quite a while ago.
This is written in 1963. Yeah, I mean, and by the way, the idea in it was written in the Human Condition, which is 1958, right?
Yeah.
58, yeah. So, in the paper, there's a paper, I've written a couple papers on this, but one which I know Lynsdey read looks at Ray Kurzweil in comparison to Hannah Arendt. Some of you may know Ray Kurzweil. He's a futurist, and he believes that we're all becoming, that humans are going to transform into a machine hybrid species, a new higher species that will eventually become at one with the universal intelligence in the world. And humans will continue to exist, but as a new kind of non-biological data-based species that will live on computer drives, or he thinks not computer drives, in some new, like, what's it called? In the ether, but in computer database. I mean, this is his religion, right? And you can laugh, but I mean, I think there's and I think Arendt would be terrified of what he sees as a dream. But I think that Arendt And that what he's talking about is what Arendt was actually worried about. I don't think it's happened yet. And if you read, and the interesting thing is, why is the human condition written, right? And she says at the very beginning, she says, it's not to stop this process because it can't be stopped. It's to think what we are doing. And, this is, if you believe Alfred Kazin, think what we're doing is like a phrase she used all the time in private conversations. She uses it a lot in her books, at least 3 or 4 of her books. And I really do believe that Arendt's response to your question about has this happened or will it happen is not so long as we think what we're doing. As long as there's some of us who keep thinking and questioning, we won't completely lose our stature, our dignity. But as she also said, there's never been a period in history where most people thought. And it's always been an activity of the few. One of the problems we have today is that most of the so-called educated people see themselves as scientists who don't think, not when they're doing science. And so there's an enormous attraction to unthinking scientism in our world, which may be the greatest danger we're facing in many ways. I mean, that's in a way what the Perils of Humanity is about, the Perils of Invention.
I'd agree. But on that thinking, I'd like just to check with our panel if we have questions. I'm looking away from you. I'm not sure which camera to look into.
I think this is the camera.
This is the camera.
Are there any of you or people? I mean, we can also take people here. We have people live.
I would,
or
Griselda Pollock.
Hi there. Thank you very much.
you have to unmute. I don't know how to unmute you.
Oh,
Hold on. Let me just. Griselda, are you speaking?
I am speaking
Are you
now.
unmuted?
I'm,
Can I hear you?
I'm-
Oh, there we go.
Can you hear me now?
Should it come on the?
1 second. Just give me 2 seconds.
I can't hear anything now.
Can you hear us now?
I can hear you now. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Hello, everybody.
Hello. Hi,
Um,
Griselda.
There's a running conversation. We're having a little chat here on the chat with various people. So that you might want to see, which is things. I have 2 questions I'd like to say, which is, for me,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I'd like to draw out 2 distinctions which seem to me really important in my reading of the text, and that is between the scientists and the model of scientific thinking, as you rightly said, a certain kind of abstraction which follows its logic. So those of us who work in, kind of feminist theory have been battling with various things like Donna Haraway and Karen Barad about the fact that certain elements of physics and indeed certain operations in contemporary biological sciences are baffling because they defy a certain kind of logic. And people are taking them up and say, this is very exciting. What particles do enables us to sort of think queerly. So there's one experience that I'm having on one side of really trying to think through Heisenberg and the others. But I think for Hannah Arendt, she's saying, okay, they can go off and think that and come up with ways of understanding how the physical world operates that is impossible for us to understand logically, but it is happening. But the problem is when those people, the plumbers, meet up with the plumbers, the engineers, and your technocrats, because it's not logical to discover that that particles do certain things, to then build atom bombs. Once you decide to use that technologically to create certain machines, which could include when you look up at the sky and say, I'm going to build a spaceship and go into it, those then become areas for political and ethical thinking, right? So for me, that was really important, that sense. It's the tech, that when you take it into technology, so all the people who worked out, you know, how computers work or possibility of computers are not responsible for Instagram and its disasters, but someone is. And that's where we have to have political thought. And the political thought has to have a ground. And the ground, it seems to me, is what she's saying is not that that it's something about human stature. It's the human position, or the position the human sees him or herself in relation to the rest of the world. So if we are irresponsible to the world, and that she argues the only, as you quoted from the human condition, the only world on which humans can live is this planet, it makes no sense to whiz off into space, because you'll only get a little further and then you'll see that the Earth is a blue globe. That's terrific, beautiful, make lots of pictures, okay, but it's useless. Go a little bit further, you'll find the red planet, and however many movies they make that imagine that you know, what's his name, whoever it was on the Mars who got left behind, or even some of the most wonderful planetary films, etc., they end up having to come back and find a way to make the Earth green. And I think so it's quite interesting to go into science fiction on one hand, and then some of the kind of queer feminist you know, philosophies of science, to come back to what she's saying. It's how we use the knowledge. And what earthliness means is, I think at the end of the essay, she says, we need to be less anthropocentric, which is what is leading to the hubris of the scientists and the technologists, and more geocentric, and that there is a correlation between human beings and the geo world. She's not articulating it, as Lynsdey's saying, through the Silent Spring, or indeed, you know, a planetary kind of, not planetary thinking, but sort of ecological thinking, but something closer to what Gayatri Spivak talks about when she talks about the difference between imagining us as global creatures, which is all in the electronic universe of communication, and planetary creatures, which incline towards each other, i.e., I feel there's an Arendtian element in Spivak, that what is it to imagine that we have to have a language in which we can speak to each other. So the scientists talking about particles being able to sort of, you know, go through two things as a wave and a whatever it is, and the uncertainty principle is no use to us. It's interesting and fantastic and marvelous to know that, but it's not useful because we have to have a language in which we can speak to each other. And so I wanted to come back to the sense of language and what earthliness is, which is not about the stature of man, but the human condition that she does. And that's why I think it's so interesting. The beginning of the human condition, she's commenting on Sputnik. What does this mean for us to think that we could leave the Earth? And when you think of the, you know, what's his name, Musk and all these others, and the billions are just trying to have, you know, you can have a jet plane, and now we're going to have a super space chain, but there's nowhere to go, nothing to do, nobody to talk to out there. So why couldn't we put all those billions back into stopping the mass starvation of our planet? So to come back to Lynsdey, yeah, I think it's very deeply about a correlation between the capitalist logic and a technological logic. If you can do it without a political or ethical question. So that's my contribution. I don't know if it's a question at all, but I really got excited by this difference between anthropocentric and geocentric and how they articulate in this essay.
Yeah, I mean, I think you were suggesting that Arendt stands on the anthropocentric side or not?
No, I think she is arguing that we are anthropocentric insofar as we think we're the only ones, and that we should be more geocentric. I think she actually says that. She says, the astronaut shot, no, it thinks, no, that's that one. Yeah, that's right. That the astronaut is attempting to eliminate all anthropocentric considerations from his encounter with the non-human, but that we should become more geocentric and anthropomorphic, although
Where
not
is that?
in the sense of the earth being the center of the universe and man being the highest being there. It would be geocentric in the sense that the earth, not the universe, is the center and home of mortal people, and it would be anthropomorphic in the sense that man would count his own factual mortality amongst the elementary conditions under which his scientific efforts are possible at all. That's
Right.
our.
So by geocentric, as far as I understand it, in that context, and I can't find what page you're on, but
273.
273, right in the end. Okay. By geocentric, I think she's simply opposing the idea. So the idea is that Archimedes thought if you could get to a point, you could leverage the earth. What she's saying is, once you lever the earth, you'll then need to lever that lever, you need to lever that level, you need to lever that lever, and there's no center. And so that science decenters not just from man, but even from the earth.
But I'm not sure she's saying pure science does it.
Well, no, I mean, the scientific theory plus the realization of it through the conquest of space or plumbers or technology, as you will. Yes.
So, if I could say
geocentric. What?
I mean, if you can say this, I think it's quite an important distinction, because I mean, a lot of us spend our time watching Richard Attenborough and all these people who are finding out all sorts of extraordinary things about what science itself is not instrumental. It's human action that instrumentalizes that knowledge.
So yes, I mean, that's where she says that the scientists themselves generally don't have a will to power, right? But scientists have been imagining a universalist science for a long time, certainly since Galileo. And they were scientists. They were doing it because they wanted to know it and know the way the world worked. That already is alienating, but it's not alienating for most of us because most of us can't understand it and it doesn't impact our lives. But when the plumbers, the people take the scientific ideas and put them in reality and shoot us off into space, then suddenly we start to see ourselves as just little specks, and that actually changes the real world. I wanted to just add on to something you said about all these Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and the new billionaire space race. There's a movement that I had a student write a senior thesis on about 12 years ago called terraforming. If any of you followed this movement, these are people who want to create new planets. So they want to go up into space and create new planets that we could move to. Some of them because they think the Earth is going to die and we need to create new planets. And some of them because they just want to do it. And you can read it. I mean, there's a fascinating amount of stuff on this online and in the world. The question Arendt asks, there's a couple of questions I think Arendt asks around something like this. One is, why do we want to leave the Earth, right? Why is it that there have been fantasies of leaving the Earth since Egypt and Greece? And why? What is it about reality, about the world, the Earth, that we don't like or that we want to replace? In one very important sense, it's that it's beyond our control, that it's scary, and it is often, there are hurricanes and tornadoes and droughts and things we can't control. And so we don't like that, and so we want to replace it. This terraforming would be very much like what she talks about at the end of the human condition about living on a spaceship where everything was artificial. Now, there's another form of terraforming. This is more the Ray Kurzweil one that I've had to read a lot about, which is that what Ray Kurzweil says is we don't need to go found a new planet because we can make our planet artificial. So his idea is that through nanotechnology, we can insert nanobots into all the water in the world and all the dirt in the world so that we could simply change the water, clean it, have it self-clean itself, have the dirt. He says we'll be able to manipulate the earth and all the elements in the same way that we currently manipulate a computer, because we're going to make it computerize the earth.
It still does. I just want to go back to the question of where Griselda's raised, where politics in an Arendtian sense comes in there. Because as you were talking, I was thinking about Elon Musk, but I was also remembering something that Yanis Varoufakis is fond of saying, is that when people say, where is politics today? Where is the great Greek polis, which Arendt, of course, loved, a version of? Where is
She
it?
also loved the Roman Republic.
She also loved the Roman Republic, but that idea of, people debating and hearing and having the leisure to do it. And Yanis Varoufakis says, if you want a version of polis today, it's Star Trek. If you watch Star Trek, it is very much like the Greek polis. There are people kind of making decisions, showing their best and worst places, having an agony.
See, I disagree with that completely. As a good Star Trekian. No, I mean, because the Star Trek people are all based on qualification. Greek leaders were not based on qualification, they're chosen randomly. The science Star Trek is, I think, Arendt's dystopia of a technocratic elite. Not
it is technocratic elite, and it's also colonial.
And very well.
But it's getting to the point, which, like, was it last year, Elon Musk literally fires Captain Kirk out into space, and no one knows why. I mean, it's not even like there's a technocratic, it's just like, I mean, it really was an Arendtian moment. It's like, what's he doing? And there's those two moments. What I'm trying to get, the elaborate metaphors is that, and I think Griselda was edging towards, there's bad politics and technocrat and power, but is there another politics that can move between this to address that, the question of where?
Well, I mean, the question of where is politics is maybe the central one, because it's disappearing in bureaucracy, in large organizations, and also in science and technocracy. There's a huge and very important movement around the world called citizen assemblies. Some of you may have heard of this. We just had a big conference on it at the Arendt Center this year. We're actually going to hold our first training session for politicians around the United States this year on how to hold citizen assemblies. And the idea here is they're very much like the old town halls or the ward systems that Arendt talks about on Revolution, but the idea of simply spaces for people to come together and speak and act. We don't know what they're going to do, but come together and speak and act. And the idea is that they could become sources of power. Whatever people speak and act together, sometimes they'll speak and act and nothing happens. But if they speak and act and get into something, they become sources of power. Now, by the way, before you romanticize this, that's what's called the trucker convoy, right? It's a space of power. And while I'm not a fan in many ways of what the trucker convoys are doing, I am incredibly aware that they are deeply Arendtian in their politics and in their actualizing collective politics against a technocratic elite. I think there's problems with it, but I think there's a real political democratic urge behind it. And part of the problem is that whenever that urge emerges, the response of the technocratic elite is to demean it, and it's becoming more and more violent. So, Arendt, there's a wonderful footnote at the end of the essay on violence. And this is what my new book that I'm really working on is about. I told you this, which is where Arendt says that the real racial problem of the future is not going to be a Jewish question or a color question. it's going to be that a small group of people who think of themselves as having more brain power than everyone else claim to be in charge, and the majority follows demagogues seeking to overthrow them, and they become increasingly tyrannical in order to hold their power. And she calls that the new race war. Race because it's based in brain power. I think that's a better analysis of what's going on in the last 5 years around the world than anything. And she wrote that in 1968. I think that's exactly what's going on. And I think she can hit the nail on the head with that one. So if we really want to bring Arendtian politics back, we have to understand that we're part of the problem. Those of us who are in this elite. And we have really disempowered the majority of citizens around the world. And Arendt saw that. She was terrified of it because she knew that the reaction of the majorities when they followed a demagogue would be extraordinary, violent. And she knew that the reaction of the elites against the demagogues would be violent. And she said, at that point, it's anyone's guess who wins. I think that's the situation we're in right now. But that's where I think politics has to be right now.
It seems quite odd to say any more questions after.
Yesterday, I was at the Gresham lecture, and what's quite interesting is the parallel of what we're saying based in the 1963 analysis. It's the science of discovering what's below the ocean. Apparently, we know more about the moon than we do about the ocean. But there is a complete, and it's really heartbreaking, absolute disregard for preservation. It is all driven, as you say, what you call it, the science and the politics and the economics. It is all headstrong in this funnel with a complete disregard to the devastation that's leaving behind. They're now putting these robotic submarines and they're just releasing them, and there's no human interference. They're just allowing these robotic machines to travel under the ocean, and that they're even finding that the light is damaging the fish because it's so black down there, and then there's out of control. And it's interesting how you're seeing the prediction actually is happening right now with this ocean research, and these scientists are absolutely out of control. There's no boundary, there's no ethics, there's no conscious.
You're absolutely right. I don't know if everyone heard. Can you all hear the question or not? No. But basically the question was about how, in the name of science and maybe even / conservation, we are putting submarines down in the ocean, and they're impacting the ocean and the fish. I think that's exactly right. I mean, there's one of the essays in this book, Perils of Invention, that's coming out in 2 weeks, is by Marianne Constable, a wonderful professor and one of my doctoral advisors. And it's about sustainability and the rhetoric of sustainability. And the whole sustainability rhetoric is that we want to sustain the earth in a natural condition. And so what are we going to do? We're going to artificially intrude ourselves into the earth so that we will somehow sustain it in a natural condition. And there's a huge, and there's complete thoughtless paradox behind the entire movement for sustainability. This doesn't mean we shouldn't, it's something that we don't hear in our daily life. So we're implanting animals with chips in order to keep them natural and things like that. And you have to wonder, what's going to happen. And whether sustainability therefore is a meaningful idea.
We've seen the after effects of what's it, Frankenstein foods now affects the local flora in the wild verges. Campions that in my childhood were the size of penny, probably pieces are now smaller than my little fingernail. And it's just like, there's no way that can produce seed. And it's just like, oh my God, just in 20 years, this plant is going to be eradicated because of commercialization of the crops. It's terrifying, really.
It's true.
But she also was very attractive to those scientists who knew they were citizens.
Yes.
So like Oppenheimer, who went before the McCarthy committee, he lost his job, was accused of being a communist. He was the guy responsible for the A-bomb, for the atom bomb. Was, you know, an active citizen and a scientist. So Heisenberg, Max Planck, all these people were not just, you know, they understood what they were doing. And I'm sure I meant to ask whether you read it, that wonderful novel by Benjamin Labatut that was up for the Booker last year, When We Cease to Understand the World. And it's a joint biography of all those guys. You know, it starts, you know, the cat guy, and it ends up all the way. And it's manic, but it's brilliant because it captures that moment, because the separation between science and thinking. And I think she understands that, yes, but it's not an actual, you know, you can't separate them that much, because there's a kind of, you know, there's the thinking of instrumentalism, there's that kind of science, but these people they can't stop thinking, they're manic, and that will take them back as citizens, as political people, as people who are making active decisions in the world they've helped create.
I think that's like one of the most difficult and important points that you're bringing up, right? How do you separate, you know, there's the old Kantorowicz idea of the king's two bodies, the king who lasts forever and the king who dies. How do you separate the scientist from the citizen when they're in the same body? And you're absolutely right that she deeply respected scientists who could also act as citizens. But there's another side of it, which is that she was incredibly suspicious of citizen scientists who pulled rank, who said, because I am a scientist, I can tell you we should isolate, or we should wear masks, or we should do this. And what she said is, what that will do is destroy all the authority of scientists, because scientists will become politicized. Just, you know, this is the end of on Truth and Politics, right? Where she says, what we learned in this essay, Truth and Politics, is that politics depends upon certain realms which are non-political: journalism, science, academics, law, right? And this is obviously something that a lot of people in the 60s on don't agree with, and she was seen as a dinosaur on this issue. But what she says is, okay, if you politicize all these things, they're going to lose their authority, which is exactly what's happened. And some people might say good, but well, that's what now we have a century in which people just aren't listening to people, onto government. And so on the one hand, yes, scientists have to be able to act as citizens, and she respects that greatly, but they have to do it as citizens, not as scientists. And, you know, we've seen what's happened in climate science when these climate scientists have gotten involved in politics. What have they done? Well, they've simplified things. They've lied a little bit. They've changed some numbers to make it more, put some pictures that were fake pictures. And when that comes out, it just delegitimates climate science. That's actually good science. And people don't trust it. And I think that's part of this. You know, there's who is it who wrote this? Oh, he's an Israeli guy. I think it's Gil Eyal. I could be wrong. I think it was Gil Eyal. Here is a chapter on the march for science. Do you remember when there was these marches for science after Trump was elected a couple years ago? And he talks about what an idiotic oxymoron. The idea that science should be something that you march for and protest and bring into the realm of feeling and emotion. I mean, it's almost exactly the opposite of what science should be. And yet, that's why science has now become a political idea. And that's what Arendt feared. And that's why while it's important that they be both citizens and scientists, the loss of the boundary, and you said it's a hard boundary, and it's a hard, blurry boundary, and I don't know how to do it, but the loss of that boundary has been catastrophic, I think, and I think she thinks.
Yeah. I'm just noting the time.
I have no idea what time
it is. Time to, I think, close.
Can I just say something? There's a lot of questions on your Q&A.
I know, but it's quite difficult to do everything at once, Griselda. Even with the science, it's my kind of ability to have my five senses in this world.
It's not science, it's technology. That's
Um,
the difference.
But it clearly means that we need another series where we
Can I
do
just-
a rent for today.
Do just one plug, right? We do every Friday, the Hannah Arendt Center has a virtual read group, which this is in a sense based on, and we read Hannah Arendt together. And any of you who would like to join, please just go to our website and join. It's very easy. I want to thank you, Lynsdey and Richard and the whole Saltoon Gallery for hosting this amazing event. And then I'll let Lynsdey finish up.
Yeah, well, thank you, Roger. Thank you, panelists and audience. I'm so sorry we haven't got twice as long to talk, and deep apologies to people on the chat. If we could save the chat, that would be really interesting for some of us.
Julia, you can save the chat. Mia, Julia,
Yeah.
can you save the chat?
That'd be great.
The
But
chat and the Q&A, there's two different things.
yes.
Oh, there's two different ones?
Okay. So on that, I think that's ended for us, which is. I'd like you to join me in thanking Roger for hosting a brilliant, really brilliant.